It is day 2 of a war that until just yesterday was for many unimaginable. And the scenes that the hours since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began have left us bring to mind times that Europe hoped to have long left behind. Metro stations turned into bomb shelters, civilians arming themselves to defend their country in heavy shelling in Kiev and across Ukraine. The facts on the ground and the measures taken to contain them are moving fast, and tonight we'll take you through what we know and try to make sense of a series of events that has left Europeans stunned and in shock. I'm Nicole Fröhlich in Berlin, and this is The Day.
Has come to pass.
Ich appelliere an Präsident Putin.
I call on President Putin to stop the madness of this war now.
You can stop this bloodshed. You alone are responsible for stopping this bloodshed.
I'm convinced that democracy and the independence of Ukraine is going to prevail.
Russia will have to talk to us sooner or later. Talk about how to end the fighting and stop this invasion.
The world will hold Russia their actions.
Welcome to the program. We begin the day with a conflict long predicted by the West, but which many considered unthinkable. As Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine enters its third day, Russian troops advance, families flee, and civilians begin taking up arms. Kiev's mayor says the city has entered a defensive phase, and Ukrainian military vehicles are entering the capital to protect it from Russian troops. Air raid sirens have been sounding in Kiev and other cities, prompting people to take shelter in metro stations. Ukraine's government says at least 137 of its soldiers and civilians have been killed across the country. President Putin of Russia has claimed he's willing to negotiate after Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky raised the possibility of discussing a neutral status for Ukraine. Thousands of civilians have fled Kiev. Those who remain are taking up arms and bracing for a violent confrontation.
Another terrifying start to the day in Kiev. Overnight, there was more destruction. Bombs rained down, forcing residents to flee to safety in bunkers. Metro stations and cellars packed with residents grappling to come to terms with their new reality. It's hard, but I'm holding on. A nearby house caught fire, and there were many victims. And we were waiting until 7 o'clock in the morning in our apartment, in the corridor, in the bathroom, until the end of curfew, so that we could come here. I work here. I feel mostly tired and anxious. It's so strange. None of it feels real. I don't even know how to relate to it all. Above them,
Here in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, and we spoke with these civilians who are terrified. They have heard this siren before over the past 36 hours, and it is often followed by a Russian air campaign targeting infrastructure on the northern part of the city. This is significant as these Russian forces look to make an offensive toward the capital of Kyiv. But we do know it's not only the Ukrainian army looking to fight back, but also civilians. We spoke with one member of parliament today who told us that he picked up a weapon from a local police station. He said they were handing them out like candy. The Ukrainian government calling on civilians to pick up arms and help the army to push back those Russian troops. Jesse.
So you said that Russian forces have officially entered the city. Are they going in shooting, or are they going in as more saboteurs to soften things up for the larger invasion?
We have heard reports of sabotage operations. Actually, President Zelensky of Ukraine spoke about this and warned citizens today against speaking with people who look like they might be suspicious. And remember, there is a martial law curfew in place right now, and it's just after midnight here in Kyiv. So there's no one on the streets except for police officers and emergency personnel. The thing to also remember is that the civilian population here is quite worried about this moving forward, so they are preparing for the worst, and many of them are willing to take up arms to fight back. Jesse?
Okay, you want to take it around the table? Judge Denis?
You know, Trey, today we heard from General Keane and General Petraeus, and each of them talked about the fact that Putin hasn't destroyed the airfield or taken down the infrastructure. And yet there's another school of thought, and I'm curious as to what you think and what people are thinking on the ground, that he is specifically not targeting the infrastructure so that he can control it when he gets in. He wants to be able to have an infrastructure.
Absolutely. He is looking to replace the government here. He wants Ukraine to be a puppet country, much like Belarus is for the Russian government in Moscow. So it wouldn't make sense for him to destroy a lot of the infrastructure across the city. Some people did worry early on that would be the case. A lot of the Western intelligence analysis was that he would target big government buildings in the capital. We have not seen that so far. It's not to say that it will not happen, but he is looking to replace the government and be in control of this capital city, but this country as a whole. So in other parts of Ukraine, we saw a similar event unfolding where Russian troops came in on the ground. There was an air campaign as part of it in cities like Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine. But we did not see that massive shock and awe campaign that many were worried about going into this, and as it started just a day and a half ago. Back to you. So
that, Trey, just to follow up, so that the thinking that, you know, the Russians aren't coming in as quickly or succeeding as quickly as people think they should may really be based upon the fact that they're trying to preserve as much as they can of the infrastructure while still going in and taking over the major cities there.
I think it's also based on the fact that the Ukrainian army put up such a fight early on. They have been taking significant losses, and the casualty numbers that we have are not up to date. It's very difficult to get accurate numbers from either side in this conflict, but they have been successful, we know, in some parts of the country with those Javelin anti-tank missiles, and they've also been successful in shooting down aircraft using air defense systems. So the Russians have faced fierce resistance, and there is a firm understanding that if they try to make it further into the capital city, again, they will take fire not only from the army, but also from civilians who have picked up weapons. And I think moving forward, that's the thing to look at here, how this battlefield will change if they do enter Kyiv. They have been fighting a lot on the outskirts of cities, and they've been targeting military installations from the air. If they get into this urban warfare situation, you will see things that look much like guerrilla warfare, where there are surprise attacks and ambushes on these troops. And that will look very different. It will be quite bloody, and it will consume this city if that does take place. Ukrainian forces on the outskirts of the capital are hoping that they are able to hold off the Russian troops before it even gets there.
Trey, what does that look like right now? That expectation of guerrilla warfare is accompanied by your reports of them handing out Kalashnikovs, breaking the age limits, potentially 14-year-olds out there. carrying AKs. But right now, as you talk about people hunkering down, some in the subway systems, I'm sure many in their homes, what does that look like? Is everybody carrying a rifle around? Is everybody barricading into their homes? Are they preparing to engage in a firefight?
We drove through the streets of Kyiv today to speak with civilians, and there weren't many out on the streets. Many were underground where we talked to them in the metro system. But when we drove by government buildings, you saw police forces and even officials who wouldn't normally be guarding a building in the downtown area outside holding weapons. They were bracing for this to take place, and they still are at this hour. This could be hours away. And the White House, Washington, officials in the United States believe that Kyiv will indeed fall in a matter of days. It's a real possibility. But what we saw was a population today that was scared, but also others who were preparing. We spoke with one man, and he came up to us speaking in English, and he told us he was an English teacher. And I'm going to give you his words here because they were quite jarring, but it gives you a sense of how tense this situation is. He said to me, "I'm not very well versed in weapons." He said, "but I will use my kitchen knife and I will slaughter those Russian pigs if they enter this city." And I'm paraphrasing here, but those were his words, calling the Russians pigs and saying he would kill them with a knife. And that is how tense things are and how much of a resistance that we do expect to see here in the capital of Kyiv if those Russian forces enter. People want the Russians out of this country. They see this invasion as a clear violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, and civilians and soldiers alike say they will do everything they can to prevent it from going any further.
Ford Jr.
If we'd only had partners like this in Afghanistan. But Trey, just real quickly, do you have a sense if are there any other weaponry coming in to Ukraine, any other country providing that, not just for individual citizens, but for the Ukrainian army?
So before this offensive by the Russians took place, we saw planes landing every day, some from the United States, some from Lithuania. The weapons were coming from NATO members and allies of the Ukrainians delivering those anti-tank missiles. That was really the biggest request that the Ukrainian military had, understanding that this would be an offensive that included many, many Russian tanks. But in recent days, there's been conversations taking place here in the capital about how more weapons could get into the country. There's nothing flying in right now because the airspace is totally closed down. So there is a possibility to move weapons in over the borders. But today we saw the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg basically say that NATO will commit anti-aircraft batteries to this country. But that does raise the big question. How are they going to get them here? And can they get them here in time? There are still Russian air campaigns taking place against this country as we speak. And quite frankly, Ukraine is running out of time. They don't have a month to wait. Yesterday at the White House, President Biden announced these sanctions to try to pressure President Putin to change his behavior and pull back these forces out of a sovereign country. And he said, basically, they want to wait 1 month to see if they're going to do any good. The Ukrainians don't have a month. They don't have 30 days. They do not have 30 minutes. This offensive is currently taking place in their capital city, and people are dying.
Quick follow-ups, casualties and coverage. Do we have a sense of the casualties on the Russian side? And what coverage, what extensive coverage or any coverage are the Ukrainians getting of what's happening on the ground there and maybe even what's happening on the ground in Russia, as we're seeing now that there may be some pushback amongst Russian citizenry against Vladimir Putin?
The Ukrainians are aware of these anti-war protests that are taking place in Russia. More than 54 cities yesterday had demonstrators who many were detained, more than 1,700 demonstrators being taken into custody because they were trying to tell their government not to go to war, not to do what they are doing right now. And so they see that solidarity, and they are very aware of what's happening in this country. One thing to note, though, for the entire world and also for the Ukrainian people who are watching this unfold, this is war, and it is so graphic and bloody taking place outside of this city and on the outskirts of the capital. The images that you see online that cannot be shown on television because they are just too gory and graphic show that a war is taking place very much like previous land wars in Europe. Bodies in the streets and tanks and artillery being targeted from the air. It is quite difficult for the Ukrainian people to just fully grasp what is happening, but they understand that their people are at risk. They understand that if they do not fight back, many of them will be slaughtered. And that is why there is so much pressure right now in the international community to do something. And if they don't act soon enough, and it may already be too late, more people in this country will die as a result of this Russian offensive.
Well, that's obviously one of the problems, because it's taken so long to get these missiles into Ukraine, and now there's sort of a panic to get them more so that they can have some better anti-aircraft defense. There are reports that a couple of days ago, President Biden approved the shipments through Latvia of Stingers, and that would be an effective weapon for the Ukrainians to have in their hands. It's proven to be effective against Russian air power in the past. Have you heard anything about that? Is there any indication that they could get them in through Poland, perhaps?
We saw those reports as well, and they would be definitely used based on the satellite images that we saw today released by Maxar Technologies, indicating that the Russians have moved more attack helicopters within 20 miles of the Ukrainian border. Just yesterday, they used similar helicopters in an effort to take over an airfield about 40 minutes from where we are right now. They really just stormed the airfield with what residents in that area described as locusts, targeting this Ukrainian military institution, because it really is an institution. It is basically the one airbase near this capital city that could give the Russians a strategic advantage in launching a larger offensive against the Ukrainian capital. It would give them the ability to land heavy aircraft with more soldiers and more equipment that they could use in a ground. I want to get back to that one other question about the casualty numbers. I've been personally avoiding the numbers and reporting them on air simply because I cannot independently verify them. And there is clearly a lot of gray area and even propaganda going on amid war. That's very common during conflict. Both sides want to talk about the numbers of people who they have killed. And I think it's very important that we are careful with the numbers, because they can often be misconstrued during conflict. Back to you.
Good point.
Thanks so much, Trey. Well, my concern after hearing that report is that the United States and NATO did not have enough weapons and supplies pre-positioned to flood the zone immediately to the Ukrainians, to the military, to the Ukraine citizens, to give them a little boost out of the gate, because it seems like it might be a little too late at this point. Do you share that concern?
Yeah, I share that concern, although we do have the reports of rifles being handed out to the citizenry as well. Look, I think the story right now, in this very moment, is the resolve of the Ukrainian people. Harold, you asked about the messages they're getting, the media they're getting. Surely they're hearing stories of what happened on Snake Island with, Jesse, you invoked the Alamo yesterday. It's almost a literal replication of the Alamo in those forces taking on the Russian Navy. Or the ghost of Kiev we're hearing about, this ace pilot that took down maybe 5 Russian fighters on his own. These are the soldier who sacrificed his life to take out a bridge, the Ukrainian soldier who died in that operation. These have to be inspirational. And then when I hear Trey say, I'm ready to use my kitchen knife, it's both inspirational and it's also terrifying of where this can and probably will go on the streets of Kiev.
I got the sense, Martha, that if it is a slaughter in the capital and the Russians do eventually overrun the entire country, the Ukrainians are never going to forgive the West. They will never forgive us. They wanted more. They wanted more help. They wanted stiffer sanctions. They want to throw up a no-fly zone right now. And if that doesn't happen, how terrible will that be?
Well, I think there's a history of presidents and leaders who will have this on their conscience, to be quite honest. We encouraged Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons. We told them that we would have their back. That was part of that whole arrangement. You go back to President Obama, who sent them meals ready to eat when they were trying to overthrow a Russian puppet regime that was in control of the country. They successfully did that anyway. It's an extraordinary legacy. There's a reason why this country is always in the news, because it is so symbolic for Vladimir Putin. He wants it back. He is humiliated by the fact that he has seen his own guy kicked out and, Yushchenko brought in, who had been poisoned by the KGB with Agent Orange. It's extraordinary. And you look at this young president, right, who is just I mean, it's a crazy story, right? He was on TV. He was a comedian. He played a principal who becomes president of the country. And now he's president of the country. And so there was this, I think, lightweight feeling about what he might be like. Look at this guy. I mean, he is a portrait of courage. He's extraordinary. He's standing on the street. He said, you know, I'm not running. You know, I'm not Ashraf Ghani. I'm not taking off with my money in a helicopter. I'm staying in my country that I love. And I'm asking, begging really, for support from NATO, for support from the United States. And now it's like, oh, we're going to try to rush stuff in at the last minute as if we didn't know this was coming. He's really an incredible story. I hope to God that he can hang on. Who knows what's going to happen for him? He called himself and his family target number 1 and target number 2. And boy, don't you know that Vladimir Putin would love to crush this guy?
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
But I give him all the credit in the world. He's really inspiring.
Yeah, he is. And here he is right here. He vows to defend the country. Let's listen.
The president is here. We are all here. Our soldiers are here. The citizens are here. And we are here. We defend our independence. That's how it'll go.
I think it was you who mentioned Afghanistan. I believe it was the Afghan president that flew out of the country the minute things got a little hot when the Taliban was taking over. This guy's staying, Harold Ford Jr.
Striking to me is the purpose and the resistance and the ownership the Ukrainians seem to have of their land and their future. And they're going to live or die on that mantle. I mentioned only, as we all know, I mean, if we literally had 10% of this metal in Afghanistan, with those troops we spent as American citizens, billions, tens of billions of dollars training, there might have been a different outcome. But let's look forward. I look at this a little differently than some around the table. There's no doubt we can go back and look at everybody from Reagan to George H.W. Bush, to Obama, to Trump, to Clinton and others, to how we may have behaved differently. We probably should have advanced more weapons as we see things now. But remember, had we done that, we would have owned this even more. Number two, I'm 51. I served in Congress from 26 years old to 36 years old. And in my lifetime as an American, I've never seen a more compelling case for America to send troops. Now, I'm not saying we should, but in Iraq, we never had this kind of evidence to say we should send troops to defend our interests. This guy's trying to undo the architecture that we spent trillions of dollars building after World War II and obviously throughout the Cold War. He has made clear he wants to reassemble everything he had before 1994. Number three, we probably hope we don't send troops there. If we're going to do anything, I think we should send to our NATO partners in the event that he does take Ukraine, in the event that he does try to encroach across another border. But what heartens me the most is what you said from the outset and what we're all saying. The kind of resistance these people are showing, this is what freedom-loving people do when someone tries to take their freedom away. We have won in many ways because it's our ideas that Putin is really going against. He's afraid of this country because he thinks they may join NATO and may join the EU. He's afraid of this country because he can't believe they don't want to come running back to him. So in so many ways, we should celebrate the beauty and the majesty of freedom. Yeah. Now, are there things we should have done differently? There's no question. But I got to tell you, I hope we're able to find ways to advance weapons to these people because their mettle, their courage, you don't see things like this. And those of us who love civics and love the country, we ought to be watching this and learning lessons from these people.
Yeah, Judge, when you get a taste of freedom as a free people in that country and they try to take it away from you 2 decades later.
This is Putin now trying to take it.
Yeah, you're going to fight to the death.
We are watching history repeat itself. What we're seeing today is President Zelensky, who put it right on the table when he said, quote, "The world's most powerful forces are watching from afar." And Putin's ego must be so inflated because he's got the Western world bowed down as he, as a political thug, goes in to attack a sovereign nation. And the West is just kind of like, oh, I don't know what we'll do. Maybe we'll sanction this. Maybe we'll sanction that. And the truth is, this isn't a movie. It looks like a movie, but these are real people who are dying. These are real people who have been begging us as we watch them line up the troops and the tanks and the blood and the temporary hospitals. And every day we saw what they were getting ready to do. And I get that Zelensky didn't want to panic his people. I get that he didn't tell them, you know, it's time to get out. But right now, this is about raw power. It's not about religion. It's not about people who hate each other. It's about a thug who wants the Russian Empire back. And you know what? The idea that the United States is today buying 500,000 barrels of oil from this thug and allowing him to make money that allows him then to fight this war is disgusting. And I'm going to add one more thing. I got to keep going. Hang on. The bottom line is that Biden doesn't want to disrupt the Russian energy exports. And we could have done it with the Keystone Pipeline. And this is all a setup. And he's talking about he doesn't want the Americans to suffer. In the end, the Americans are suffering and the Ukrainians are suffering.
Everybody's suffering.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.
All right. Am I on here? Oh, okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Uncommon Core lecture. The causes. Michael Volchak. I attended the university from 1986 to 1991. I got a bachelor's in political science and a master's in international relations. Professor Mearsheimer was a tremendous influence on my life. Completely revolutionizing my worldview, changed how I looked at international relations, politics, just everything. In fact, he was such a big influence on my life that, when I went home for the summer between one of the school years, leaving my college girlfriend here, she gave me a little keepsake picture book, and she said, "Here, to remember the people you love." And inside was a picture of her on the right and a picture of Professor Mearsheimer on the left. That's a true story. When I was here, the two biggest things that for me were military affairs and the Model United Nations of the University of Chicago, the student organization that I co-founded in 1988. And at that time, I discovered that you need a faculty advisor in order to have a registered student organization. So, of course, I thought for about 2 seconds, and then I went to see Professor Mearsheimer. And I'm not sure if he remembers this, but I asked him, "Will you be our faculty advisor?" And he said, "I will sign the piece of paper if I never have to do anything else after that." So I had found my faculty advisor. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Professor of Political Science, Professor John J. Mearsheimer.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thanks all for coming out to hear me talk. The subject I want to talk about is the causes and consequences of the Ukraine crisis, which of course has been in the news in a really big way since February 2014. And indeed, there was a big story on the civil war in eastern Ukraine in the newspapers this morning. The outline I'd like to follow is I'd just like to make a number of preliminary comments to give you some background on this crisis. Then I'd like to give you my thinking on what caused the crisis. Then tell you why I think the conventional wisdom is wrong. Talk a little bit about the West's response so far to the crisis, which is just, in my opinion, making a bad situation worse. And tell you what I think should be done. And then finally wrap up with some discussion of the consequences. So let me start with some preliminary comments. First, with regard to America's core strategic interests. For me, core strategic interests are areas of the world where you're willing to fight and die. And in my opinion, outside of the Western Hemisphere, which is of enormous strategic importance to us, there are only 3 areas of the world that really matter. 1 is Europe, 2 is Northeast Asia, and 3 is the Persian Gulf. And it's very important to understand that since this country got its independence in 1783, Europe has been the most important area of the world. Even though the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor, we had a Europe first policy going into the war, and we had a Europe first policy throughout the war. And it's in large part because the great powers in Europe are more important than the great powers in Northeast Asia over time. And of course, the Persian Gulf was an important area because that's where the oil is, and oil is a critical resource that matters greatly in the international system. So those are the three most important areas outside the Western Hemisphere. And again, since the beginning of this country, Europe has been number one. You want to understand that we're undergoing a fundamental shift of great importance. Asia, because of the rise of China, is going to be the most important area of the world for the United States. The Persian Gulf, because it's inextricably linked with Asia, oil flowing to India, oil flowing to China, the Persian Gulf will be number two. And Europe will be a distant three. We're basically leaving Europe in the rearview mirror. And of course, you want to keep this in mind because the Ukraine crisis is in Europe and it involves NATO. Just how to think about the geography of Europe. This is a simple, if not simplistic, way of thinking about it. But here's a map. You can see where Ukraine is. You can see where Poland is. You can see where Russia is. The way I think about European security is there's France, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. Of course, we're moving from west to east. These are the big kahunas. These are the big countries that matter. And of course, the two countries that matter the most historically are Germany and Russia, or for most of the 20th century, Germany and the Soviet Union. And I put them in red because, as you well know, both Germany and the Soviet Union fought bitter wars in Poland, in Ukraine, and we could add in Belarus as well, if need be. But as we go along here, you want to keep in mind that Ukraine is right next to Russia, and Poland is right next to Ukraine. And then out further west is Germany and France. Take this a step further. This is the ethnic breakdown of Ukraine. I'm going to show you a number of maps, all of which are designed to show you that Ukraine is a badly divided country, and what's taking place inside Ukraine today is in good part a civil war. And to that extent, it doesn't have that much to do with what the Russians or the West are doing there. And as you can see in red are mostly Ukrainian-speaking people. And then as you move further east, you're talking about lots of Russians and certainly lots of Russian speakers. This is the Ukraine election of 2004. This is the election in the wake of the famous Orange Revolution, which I'll talk more about. As you can see, the country is badly divided between the East and the West. The Russian speakers in the East and the Ukrainian speakers in the West. This is the 2010 election, which resulted in Yanukovych getting elected. I'll talk about President Yanukovych as we go along. He was elected in 2010. And you can see there the voting patterns in the 2010 election look a lot like the voting patterns in the 2004 election. And then these are two recent surveys that came out from the International Republican Institute, that's here in the United States. This one says, if Ukraine could enter only one international economic union, which of the following should it be? And of course, the blue is the EU, and the light blue is the customs union, or actually the red is the customs union of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And the cities up at the top are in western Ukraine, and the cities down on the bottom are in eastern Ukraine. So you can see very clearly that people in the west like the red and the But all this tells you we have a badly divided country. And the conflict between the West and Russia over Ukraine is played out in the context of this. This is a simple little geograph. It shows Europe's dependence on Russian gas. It's quite clear from that geograph developed for us to put pressure on the Russians. Okay, those are just a number of preliminary comments I wanted to throw out just to set this up. Let's talk about the causes of the conflict. I think if you're going to talk about the causes of the conflict, you have to come at it from three different perspectives. First of all, you have to ask, what are the deep causes of the crisis? What are the structural factors that underpin this conflict? Then you have to talk about the precipitating causes, because the crisis broke out on February 22nd, 2014. Things were not terrible until February 22nd, 2014. And that's when everything went to hell in a handbasket. And the question is, what caused it then? If you focus on deep causes, it can't tell you why something happened in February 2014, but the precipitating causes are designed to get at that. And then what we want to talk about is the Russian reaction. Why the Russians did what they did with regard to Crimea, with regard to eastern Ukraine. We want to talk about exactly what they did and then why they did it. So let's start with the deep causes. My argument is that the West is principally responsible for this mess, not the Russians. This, of course, is not the conventional wisdom in the United States. And in fact, except for Steve Cohen, who's now at now at NYU, he used to be at Princeton, Henry Kissinger, and maybe a handful of other people, there are not many people who agree with me. But I think the facts are quite clear on this, that the West is responsible. And my aim is that the main deep causes, the aim of the United States and its European allies, to peel Ukraine away from Russia's orbit and incorporate it into the West. Our basic goal has been to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. End of story. And we will do everything we can to make sure it does not happen. That's the deep cause. Now, take it a step further. There are three key elements in our strategy. The first is NATO expansion, and in many ways the most important. And I'll talk in some detail about that in a second. But as you all know, since the Cold War ended, uppity with the Russians and we would back them because they were going to become part of NATO. That's not what happened. And you know what happened. The Russians clobbered the Georgians, and Georgia is in deep trouble today because it thought it could become part of NATO. So you want to remember that April 2008 summit, very important. That declaration, very important. And then what happens is you have a war. So those are the deep causes, those three strategies: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and promoting democracy. What about the precipitating cause? The key events leading up to the coup. It's the coup of February 22nd, 2014 that's of enormous importance. That's what really throws the crisis into gear. Just think about that word, coup. Orange Revolution, promoting democracy, the coup, February 22nd, 2014. So the question is, what causes the coup? It all starts in November of 2013. At that point, Yanukovych, President Yanukovych, who's the head of Ukraine, is negotiating with the EU to form an association agreement that brings the EU much closer together. It's a step in the direction of incorporating Ukraine into the European Union, or to put it in slightly different terms, incorporating Ukraine into the West. The Russians make it clear that this is unacceptable. The Russians are willing to do a deal that involves the EU, Russia, the IMF, and Ukraine. But the idea that Ukraine is going to do a deal exclusively with the EU and the Russians are going to be left out in the cold is not something that Putin is willing to countenance. He puts significant pressure on the Ukrainians. He offers them a terrific deal. And as you can imagine, the EU is not offering Ukraine a particularly good deal because you know how much corruption there is in Ukraine. And the EU wants Ukraine to eliminate that corruption, which the Ukrainians really don't want to do. So what Putin does is not only make it clear that that deal is not going to happen, but he often offers a sweetheart deal of his own. So Yanukovych, on November 21st, says no to the EU. This leads to a series of protests. The Ukrainian government, truth be told, under Yanukovych, overreacts to the protests, which causes them to spiral out of control. And in January of 2014, you can see there, January 22nd, 2014, you have your first 2 deaths in the protests. These are the Maidan protests. And then in the February 18th through February 20th time period, lots of people die. It's really messy. And what happens is that a number of European foreign ministers, the German foreign minister, French foreign minister, they fly to Kiev, and a deal is worked out to have elections that will, in effect, remove Yanukovych from power. But the protesters refuse to accept the deal. And there are significant fascist elements among the protesters who are armed, right? There's killing on the Maidan. And as a result, Yanukovych flees for his life to Russia. And this all happens on February 22nd. And, oh, did I not have that slide on? I'm sorry. One of the problems with this lectern is you can't see. I'm sorry, that's the slide that has all the key events. Oh, gosh. Sorry. I have 2 slides up here, so I lost track of the fact. So here are the key events after the coup. On February 23rd, Parliament votes to repeal minority language laws in the East. This is basically the Russian language. And then on February 27th, Russian units begin seizing checkpoints in the Crimea. On the 28th, additional Russian forces begin moving into the Crimea. The Russians didn't conquer or invade Crimea. Actually, the Russians didn't invade Crimea. They were already there because they had a leasing agreement. There's a naval base at Sevastopol, and the Russians were leasing that naval base from Ukraine. So they had military forces there. So when it says Russian units begin seizing checkpoints on the 27th, those were Russian units that were already there. Then additional Russian forces begin moving in on the 28th. And then on the 6th, the 16th, and the 18th, you have a scenario, you have a handful of events that lead to Russia incorporating Crimea. And then, of course, shortly after that, conflict breaks out in eastern Ukraine. And although we do not have a lot of hard evidence that the Russians are physically involved in eastern Ukraine, I think it's quite clear that they are physically involved, that there are Russian troops there. How many is very hard to tell from the outside. I think it's very clear that the Russian government is going to great lengths to make sure that those pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine are capable of maintaining a certain amount of independence. And I'll talk more about this in a second. Okay, understanding the Russian response. What is the Russian response? Two parts. First is they took Crimea and they're not giving it back. Crimea is gone. Second is what they're doing is not trying to conquer Ukraine. There are many people who say the Russians are going to go on a rampage, they're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia, and so forth and so on. That's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that. You remember what happened when the Russians invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened when we invaded Iraq? You remember what happened when the Israelis invaded southern Lebanon? You want to stay out of these places. In fact, if you really want to wreck Russia, what you should do is encourage it to try and conquer Ukraine. Putin, again, is much too smart to do that. What Putin is doing is he's basically in the process of wrecking Ukraine, and he's telling the West in very simple terms, you have two choices. You either back off, right, and we go back to the status quo ante before February 22nd, 2014, where Ukraine is a buffer state, or you continue to play these games where you try and take Ukraine and make it a Western bastion on our doorstep, in which case we'll wreck the country. And they are, of course, now in the process of wrecking it, right? And they're going to keep this conflict going for as long as they have to. That's the basic game here. Again, two steps. One, took Crimea. No way they're going to ever let Crimea become a NATO base. And remember, the name of the game here is to make Ukraine part of NATO. Not happening. And they're not getting Crimea. We've taken Crimea, we're keeping it, number one. And number two, you want a frozen conflict or you want to wreck Ukraine so that it can't become part of the West. Question number two here is what motivates this? What motivates this is that Russia is a great power and it has absolutely no interest in allowing the United States and its allies to take a big piece of real estate of great strategic importance on its western border and incorporate it into the West. This should be hardly surprising to the United States of America. As all of you know, we have a Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically says that the Western Hemisphere is our backyard, and nobody from a distant region is allowed to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. I can tell from looking at the audience that most of you are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis like I am. You remember how we went stark raving crazy at the idea of the Soviets putting military forces in Cuba? This is unacceptable. Nobody puts military forces in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. Can you imagine 20 years from now a powerful China forming a military alliance with Canada and Mexico and moving Chinese military forces onto Canadian and Mexican soil, and us just standing there and saying, this is no problem. We're all 21st century people, and worrying about Chinese forces there is what 19th century people like Vladimir Putin worry about. Of course that's not going to happen. We're going to maintain the Monroe Doctrine with regard to China just as we did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So nobody should be surprised that the Russians were apoplectic about the idea of us putting Ukraine on the western side of the ledger. And by the way, they told us, I gave you the quotes, in the wake of the Bucharest summit. I told you what happened in August 2008 with the Georgia war. The precedents were there. The rhetoric was there. They told us. But we did not stop our efforts to make Ukraine part of the West. And the Russians responded. Was it surprising? For some reason, President Obama and virtually all of the elites in the West were surprised. I guess this is because they're 21st century people, right? And they think that balance of power politics doesn't matter anymore. If you think these people in Washington and most Americans are having trouble dealing with the Russians, you can't believe how much trouble we're going to have with the Chinese. I'm very popular in China. I go to China quite often. And I usually start my talks by saying, it's good to be back among my people. Because when I'm in China, I'm intellectually much more at home there than I am in Washington. Because in Beijing, much like in Moscow, you're dealing with 19th century people like me. Whereas in Washington, you're dealing with 21st century people. I think the Chinese are going to eat our lunch, right? Talk a bit about the conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is that Putin is the main cause of the crisis. Some say he's either crazy or irrational. Angela Merkel was making this argument for a while. He's bent on creating a greater Russia, and he bears marked resemblance to Adolf Hitler. Say a few words about each of these. I know a great deal about Adolf Hitler. I've written and I teach extensively on Nazi Germany's behavior in the 30s and during World War II. The idea that he bears any resemblance to Adolf Hitler is laughable in the extreme. It's hard to believe that serious people make that argument. The idea that he's bent on creating a greater Russia, I think if he could do it, he'd do it. He can't do it. Russia's a declining great power. And as I said to you before, if they were to try and create a greater Russia by invading Ukraine and by invading the Baltic states, they'd be jumping into the briar patch. In fact, again, if you want to wreck Russia, what you should do is tell them to try and create a greater Russia. It will lead to no end of trouble. I think Putin is much too smart for that, and he is in the process of wrecking Ukraine. I want to make that clear. And he's wrecking Ukraine because he's basically saying to the West, you can't have it, and I'll wreck it before you take it. Is he crazy or irrational? I don't think so. I think he's very strategic. And I don't think he's the main cause of the crisis, as I said to you. Another set of arguments associated with the conventional wisdom. This is that the United States is a benign hegemon seeking to promote European stability, seeking to promote stability in Asia, all over the globe, and so forth and so on. There's some countries like Japan and Germany, for sure, Poland, who view the United States as a benign hegemon. There are many countries out there who do not. Iran is one, China's another, and Russia's a third. They just don't see it that way. And because they don't see it that way, you should understand that when you take measures, you meaning the United States, that you think are going to be interpreted as benign, the other side will not see them that way. They will see them as threatening. This gets back to my point about democracy promotion. We believe democracy promotion is an unalloyed good, and we can't understand why people like Putin and the leaders in Beijing don't understand this, but they don't understand it. And if you don't recognize what other people think, you're incapable of putting yourself in their shoes, you're going to get yourself into a heck of a lot of trouble. And of course, that's exactly what happened here. And then another argument is that Putin's behavior proves that it was wise to expand NATO eastward to try to include Ukraine and Georgia, right? What's very interesting is that there is no evidence that we thought Putin was aggressive before the crisis. There's no evidence that we thought that. There's no evidence that we were talking about expanding NATO because we had to contain the Russians. Because again, NATO expansion was driven by 21st century men and women. They believed balance of power politics is dead. That's what happened here. Do you understand? Putin is a 19th century man. Right. He does view the world in terms of balance of power politics, as do we when it comes to the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. But in this case, in the case of Europe, we were thinking like 21st century men and women. And we thought that we could just drive right up to his doorstep and it wouldn't matter. Right? We did not think that Russia was aggressive. What happened here is that after the crisis broke out on February 22nd, we then decided that Russia was aggressive. We then decided that Russia was bent on creating a greater Russia. It was after the fact. And by the way, this is why President Obama and virtually all of Washington was caught with their pants down when this crisis broke out after February 22nd, because they did not see it coming. Talk a little bit about our response. We're basically doubling down. We're getting tougher and tougher with the Russians. That's our strategy. And that's exactly what you'd expect if you're going to blame them, given that we're incapable of blaming ourselves because we never do anything wrong. You all know that. All the problems in the world are caused by everybody else, never by the United States, because we're a benign hegemon. Well, if we're the good guys and they're the bad guys and they're misbehaving, they're bent on creating a greater Russia, oh my God, this is the 1930s all over again. Any sort of concession to Putin is Munich, October 1938. You can't do that. So what you do is you double down. You get tougher and tougher. Then this brings us to the question of whether we can succeed or not. My argument is you